that this is also a psalm that consists of a prayer. Now again, we've looked at these psalms that are classified as maskils. This maskil is a type of psalm where the writer, in this case David, is meditating upon the circumstances that he finds himself. And of course, there in the header, the circumstance simply says that he was in the cave. Now, with that in mind, even though this isn't a very specific statement, one of the passages in which we can find a connection is 1 Samuel 22, verse 1, and then again in 1 Samuel 24, verse 3. Those are two different instances where David was in a cave. He was being pursued and escaping from King Saul, along with other men who aligned themselves with King Saul. So what David does, among other things, is that he writes this psalm. But as we already pointed out, this psalm is not only this maskil, but it also is a prayer. Now, what is a prayer, just in its simplest sense? A communication with God. That is the simplest way to put it. So what David is doing in writing this psalm is he's communicating with God. But more specifically, when we read through the text of this psalm, excuse me, what we find is that this psalm is a prayer where David is crying out to God. Now, what does that mean to cry out to someone? Exactly. It's an emotionally charged statement, in this case, a prayer. Any other ideas? Okay, sometimes we cry out of desperation. There's definitely evidence that David is doing that here in the text. So yes, these are ideas behind crying out. Now, one reason we know that David is crying out in this prayer is because both in verses 1 and 5 of this psalm, David says that he is crying out in the midst of the circumstances he's facing. Now, what we should also understand from these things is just that David crying out to God is he's not only praying to God, but he's praying out loud in order to ask God to help him through these circumstances that he's going through. Now, with that being the case, I think this psalm breaks down pretty easily based on those crying out statements. But we do find two specific reasons that David was crying out to God, or as the text puts it more specifically, crying out to the Lord. Reason number one, based on verses 1 through 4, is that David cried to the Lord because he was overwhelmed. He says his spirit was overwhelmed. And the second reason we find in verses 5 through 7 is that David cried out to the Lord because he was brought low, is what at least the New American Standard says. Now, what we'll learn from these things is that in our times of difficulty, we too should cry out to the Lord out of a realization that he is our source of help through the difficulties we might face in this life. So we'll start by reading this psalm, and then we'll get into the points. So again, that's Psalm 142 that we're in. David says, I cry aloud with my voice to the Lord. I make supplication with my voice to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before him. I declare my trouble before him. When my spirit was overwhelmed within me, you knew my path and the way where I walk. They have hidden a trap for me. Look to the right and see. Look, for there is no one who regards me. There is no escape for me. No one cares for my soul. I cried out to you, O Lord. I said, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Give heed to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me. Bring my soul out of prison, so that I may give thanks to your name. The righteous will surround me, for you will deal bountifully with me. So again, in this psalm, we're seeing that David cried out to the Lord and looking at some reasons why. The first one is because he was overwhelmed. We don't run in that immediately in verse 1, but in addition to saying that he's crying aloud to the Lord, he also says, I make supplication with my voice to the Lord. Now, does everyone have the word supplication there in the second line of verse 1? Okay. What does it mean to make supplication? Okay, to ask for something. That is part of the idea. Any other ideas? To plea, absolutely. It's to ask for something. What's that, Andrew? To plead or beg. So that's what David is doing here. Is he's crying out to God, but in doing that, he's asking for help. But the text says he's doing so with his voice. So this is what lends to the idea that this isn't just a silent prayer to God. Is he's verbalizing his prayer and crying out loud using the words of the text. Anything else on verse 1? For mercy? Okay. Um, that might be part of his prayer here, that he's crying out for mercy because it is asking for help. When you're asking someone for help, there might be mercy involved in that. Anything else on verse 1? All right. So let's go on to verse 2. Continuing with this idea of crying out to God. According to verse 2, what else is David doing in this prayer? Okay. Absolutely. Does everyone have the word complaint there? Yes. Okay. So yes, there is the idea of complaint here, but the point he's making here is that he's expressing to God these difficulties that he's going through. Now, the words complaint and trouble they're parallel words. It's not that he's necessarily whining and complaining in the way that we think of it, but it's just making the point that he's pouring out to God these things that he's going through. And so we should keep that in mind, that complaint and trouble, they're synonymous words that David is using. Questions or comments on verse 2? That's true. That's true. So he's going through a lot at this time. Anything else on verse 2? All right. So going on into verse 3, that's where we're going to see the fact that he's overwhelmed. He's declaring these things to God that he's going through, but now he begins to describe even more of his circumstance. He says in verse 3, I'll just read it again. When my spirit was overwhelmed within me, you knew my path and the way where I walk. They have hidden a trap for me. Now, I first want to ask, does everyone have overwhelmed there? Yeah, okay. Grows faint? Okay, we'll talk about that. Um, but what does it mean to be overwhelmed or to grow faint? Okay, that's definitely part of the idea, and that's going to come out in verse 4. Anything else on overwhelmed? Okay. All right, so with those things in mind, in this verse, David is expressing the fact that even when he was in a state of spiritual weakness, God was still watching over him, even though his enemies were seeking to trap him. Now, the NIV uses the word grows faint. That is the idea behind this word overwhelmed. It's a more literal way to translate it. But in this particular context is that David was in a state of weakness, but he says on the level of his spirit. Now, when we're talking about our spirit, what are some things we might be referring to? Okay. It is his emotional state, but yes, yeah, you're on the right track as well. It's your inner being. It's who you are. Probably. Yeah. All right. Yeah, we'll get there. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the state of mind that he's in. So this idea of overwhelmed is that idea of feeling weak, not able to do anything about the situation. Andrea? That's true. Yeah. There was some of that in our house situation. So that's the state of mind David is in this state of spiritual weakness or feeling faint, not knowing what to do. But he acknowledges something. He says to God, "You knew my path and the way where I walk." Now, what's that language lend to? What does he know about God in the midst of his situation? He knows God is with him. He knows God is watching over him. He knows where he's going. He knows I mean, his language here says he feels alone, but in his intellectually, he knows that he's not. So that's what those two lines are about. But then he goes back to his enemies. In the last line, he says, "They have hidden a trap for me." His enemies are out to trap him. But even in that circumstance, he knows God is watching over him. Questions or comments on verse 3? And snare is another word for trap there. And yes, that would be another way to render this last line of the verse. Anything else on verse 3? All right. So with all that being true, in verse 4, David continues his plea to God. The New American Standard says, "Look to the right and see, for there is no one who regards me. There is no escape for me. No one cares for my soul." Now, does anyone have a different reading there in verse 4? Okay, so that other than that, it's the same. Okay. So this builds on verse 3. Now, what David is doing here in verse 4 is calling on God to take notice of his circumstances. And again, that's because, at least his state of mind, is he feels there's no way out. But it starts off with this phrase, "Look to the right and see." Now, this is a phrase where David is using battle imagery to ask God to take notice of his circumstances. One reason we know that is because a person who is being protected or defended would be to the right of the one who is doing the defending and protecting. So David is looking to God for protection, but he's asking God, "I need that protection now. Take notice of it." So David applies that imagery to ask God to take notice of what is happening to him. Why? According to this verse, how is David feeling, as pointed out earlier? Yeah, he feels abandoned. So God is the only person he can rely on. He uses this language. No one regards him. There's no escape for him. No one cares for him. That's all a way of saying that David feels no one's concerned about him in his situation other than God. Questions or comments? Elaine, is your hand up? Okay. Saul is not, I mean, obviously Saul's not named, but based on the first Samuel passages I mentioned, it seems Saul is still after him. Again, that was 1 Samuel 22, and then again in verse 24 where we find two different instances where he's in a cave. So it's very likely he's being pursued still by Saul at this point, along with others who have aligned themselves with Saul. It's a good question. Um, Anything else on verse 4? Okay. Yeah, I have a footnote on that myself. So, absolutely. Still feeling that sentiment. There's no way out. The overwhelmed. So, but even though that's the case, what we also see here is that David takes comfort in the fact that God is caring for him, that God is watching over him. Again, we see his faith in the midst of all these things. So, putting verses 1 through 4 together, the point we should see from these verses is that David cried to the Lord because his spirit was overwhelmed. He's reached a point where he's feeling that spiritually overwhelming, but again, a more accurate way to put it is that he's feeling spiritually weak because of these circumstances that he's facing. So he cries out to the Lord. He pleads with God to take notice of the overwhelming circumstances he's facing that are a product of what his enemies are doing to him. That brings us into verses 5 through 7, another reason David cried out to the Lord, and that's that he was brought low. Verse 5, the point is introduced. He says, I cried out to you, O Lord. I said, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. So there again, we see David saying he cried out to the Lord, but he says something else that he recognizes about God. This idea that God is his refuge and his portion in the land of the living. Now, what is the word refuge? What is a refuge? It's a safe place. It's a place of protection. So he's acknowledging that about God, but he also adds God is his portion in the land of the living. Now, what's a portion of something? It's a piece of something, or I might say a share of something. So David is using that word to say that God is his piece or his share in this life. Now, one reason we know that is because the phrase the land of the living is one way of referring just to this life in general. When we're in this life, we are in the land of the living. When we die, we're in the place of the dead, just using the same kind of language. But part of what David is recognizing is that God is the reason he's alive. And so knowing that, that's why God is his refuge, is his protection, why one reason he's been spared from death up to this point in his life. Questions or comments on verse 5? Okay. So going on to verse 6, what does David ask there in that first line? To listen to him. And that's the idea here, to give heed, is what the New American Standard uses. Now, why? Why is David asking God to listen to him according to this verse? Okay, and what in the verse tells us that? What line? I am brought low. What does it mean to be brought low? Can't feel any worse. Okay. Any other ideas? Okay. Okay. Desperation. These are all good ideas attached to it. He recognizes his own weakness. Okay. So those are all ideas that are tied into it. But another idea behind it is the idea of humiliation. When you're brought low, you're in a state where you've been humbled or humiliated. But what he's doing here in using this language is that he's recognizing in what desperate need he is of God. He's in this place where he feels like no God. And why? Exactly. He can't do it alone, so he's asking God, rescue me from these individuals who are pursuing me. And the American Standard uses that word persecutors, which is a word that means to pursue or to chase after. We obviously see it in the New Testament. So, and the reason for that, as Andrew pointed out, is because his enemies are a lot stronger than him. And he knows he can't do it on his own. Questions or comments on verse 6? All right. So this brings us to the concluding verse of this psalm. David says, "Bring my soul out of prison so that I may give thanks to your name. The righteous will surround me, for you will deal bountifully with me." So what's the request here? Was David now asking God? Okay, that's the idea. So he's picturing himself as being in prison. This doesn't mean that he's literally in prison necessarily, but he's using this kind of language to say that again, this is how he's feeling. He is in a cave. That's part of what's making him feel imprisoned, because that's the only place he's safe. But he wants to be freed from that circumstance. But the only person who's going to free him is God. So he goes on and gives a reason as to why he wishes for God to do that. He says, "So that I may give thanks to your name." Now, we've run into this idea of God's name before. What are some ideas behind it? The idea of God's name. Okay, it might be his power. What else? Okay, giving honor to him. That's definitely tied in. Any other ideas? Okay, so yeah, that's another idea behind God's name, is his reputation. So the two primaries are God's power and his authority. So David wishes to be freed from this prison that he feels he's in. And the reason for this is so that he can give thanks to God's name, his power, his character, or both. Both might be in mind here. The result of that will be that the righteous will surround him, he says. Now, who are the righteous? Those that are right with God. We might use the word saints there. But yes, the righteous here is one way of referring to God's people, those who are in a right relationship with God. So the flow of thought that David is giving here is that if he's freed from this prison, he'll give thanks to God, but another result will be that he'll be surrounded by other people who are in a right relationship with God. And then he concludes by saying, "For you will deal bountifully with me." Now, what does that word bountifully mean? In abundance. So applying that here, how is God going to deal? How will God have dealt with him when he frees David from this prison? Overflowing goodness. That's a good answer to this. So, and it is because of that word bountifully. It's a very generously. And so it's all because, sorry, got just a little knot in my throat. It is the idea that because of who God is, his goodness, and freeing David from this prison that he feels he's in. And it goes back all the way to the rest of the psalm. So putting verses 5 through 7 together, the point we should see from these verses is that David cried to the Lord because he had been brought low. He's humbled by his circumstance, so he's looking to God for protection, and he knows that God will rescue him from his circumstances, and all that will result in David giving thanks to God and being surrounded by other followers of God, and all because God will have rewarded David in a generous manner. Any questions or comments on that? On verse 7 or verses 5 through 7. Okay. So when we consider everything that David has written in this psalm, the point we should be left with is that David cried to the Lord. Why? Because he was overwhelmed and because he was brought low. So the application of that is the same. There will be times when we are going to be crying out to the Lord, possibly because we're in a state of spiritual weakness, or we might be humiliated by the circumstances we're in. So when we face these circumstances that might make us feel that way, our response should be the same: to cry out to the Lord in prayer, to pour out our complaints before Him with a faith that He will bring us through those difficult circumstances. And the end result will be that we will have an attitude of gratefulness and find the encouragement of being surrounded by others who are in a right relationship with God, all because of God having dealt with us in this generous manner. So that's a lot of information. Any other questions or comments on anything we've looked at? Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, He doesn't want us to hide those kind of feelings from Him. Anything else on what we've looked at? All right. Don, would you close us today?